When Hagerman asked, "Must all men employed be Union men?" Calderwood responded with, "Yes, if there are enough to go around." The United States during the late 19th century, a period known for imperial expansion, industrial growth, and the rise of the labor movement. The 1894 Western Federation of Miners, WFM, strike in Cripple Creek, Colorado, established two of the most important and lasting historical frontiers in the fight for workers' rights in the American West. The unionization of thousands of new workers in Cripple Creek, Colorado, and across the Rocky Mountain West established organized labor for the first time in many parts of the U.S., and one of the first times that the U.S. government advocated for and endorsed a labor union rather than a corporation or business. The frontiers set by the Cripple Creek strike helped lay the framework for the future of government-labor relations into the 20th century through the reforms of the Roosevelt presidents and John F. Kennedy.
Colorado's initial American settlement began in 1858 when gold was discovered near the South Platte River, sparking the area's first gold rush. Later in 1891, gold was once again discovered, this time in the Pikes Peak area. This discovery led to rapid settlement there. After only 3 years, more than 150 mines were operating. During the 1890s, the most prominent town in the area was known as Cripple Creek. Seeking fast fortunes for hard labor, men across the country raced to the west to find employment in rapidly developing mining towns. They faced abysmal conditions and were subjected to back-breaking work that required intense physical labor within dark and cramped spaces.
Fairly common that there would be falls of rock. Explosives were very important in the mining industry. But
harrowing conditions like these created an intense demand for an organization to protect their rights. In 1893, miners from Idaho, Colorado, Utah, and Montana met in Butte, Montana to form a union, the Western Federation of Miners. By the late 19th century, labor movements in the eastern U.S. had gained immense traction, boasting powerful national organizations such as the American Federation of Labor. Despite this, the labor movement in the western U.S. was sporadic and lacked any kind of powerful national organization like the East had. The creation of the WFM changed this dramatically, creating a frontier in history. In 1893, an economic panic shook the United States. It prompted mine owners in Cripple Creek area to demand more hours for lower pay from their miners. In January of 1894, mine owners J.J. Hagerman, David Moffett, and Aben Smith, who altogether employed 1/3 of the area's miners, announced the workday to be raised from 8 to 10 hours with no change in their pay of $3 a day. Cripple Creek's miners were outraged and were represented by the newly created WFM. During that month, there was a work stoppage by the miners against the mine owners. There were attempts to create a compromise, but by February, the mine owners were unwilling to concede a 10-hour workday. On February 7, 1894, the strike began. The miners in Cripple Creek struck en masse. They closed mines and set up picket lines. Miners who continued to work contributed 10% of their wages to those striking. By late spring, the mine owners were desperate to end the strike. In order to gain leverage, mine owners hired a local sheriff, M.F. Bowers, to deputize a paramilitary force. With the strike being threatened by this, the WFM president John Calderwood took action of his own, having the strikers organize militarily upon Bull Hill Bluff. To counter this, 125 deputies sent by Bowers constructed a camp adjacent to the strikers on Bull Hill. Several strikers placed dynamite in a house nearby the deputies' camp. The explosion that followed terrified the deputies, causing them to flee their camp. The embroilment left the owners outraged. They once again turned to Bowers, this time demanding a force of 1,200 men, mostly ex-police officers and firefighters, to keep the strikers in check. As the tensions escalated, one of the most important unknown figures in Western history, Colorado Governor Davis Wade, intervened. Wade was a populist politician, lawyer, and abolitionist who came to Colorado in 1879. He practiced law in Aspen, helping miners settle disputes against mining companies. Wade came to understand and empathize for the plights of Colorado miners. He was elected governor of Colorado in 1892, and he made protecting the rights of the general public and workers his primary goal.
Where Davis Wade was coming from then was this idea of that the government should work for the people instead of for the corporations.
Wade declared Sheriff Bowers' force of 1,200 deputies to be illegal. intervening on the side of the miners, an act uncommon for the time. In the late 19th century, as a principle of tradition, politicians sided with corporations rather than unions. Presidents such as Benjamin Harrison and Rutherford B. Hayes intervened on the side of major corporations. Waite broke tradition by siding with the strikers, creating a frontier in history. On June 2nd, Governor Waite, Calderwood, and the owners met in Denver for negotiations. The parties agreed to resume the $3 per day wage and the 8-hour workday, as well as a peace between the miners and the owners, a decisive victory for the miners and the WFM. The initial agreement finally went into effect, allowing the miners to return to work, ending the strike in June of 1894.
The conclusion of the strike created yet another frontier in history, the triumph of the labor movement in the Rocky Mountain West. The WFM became widely supported in Cripple Creek, organizing many workers into 54 local unions.
Cripple Creek becomes known as the Gibraltar of unionism in Colorado. And
their influence across the West was also expanded. The Topeka State Journal in May of 1895 highlighted their growth by noting, "The coal miners' unions, representing thousands of men in several western and northwestern states, were admitted to membership in the Federation." Organized labor hardly existed in many areas of the West at the time, but the strike's success allowed for its growth, establishing a notable frontier in the history of Western labor. The strike's achievement of an 8-hour workday for $3 pay helped regularize fair pay and work time for miners across the Western U.S., who previously did not have access to these fair conditions. Despite the Federation's budding growth, they would soon become involved in a new conflict, the Colorado Labor Wars of 1903 to 04. This constituted the WFM striking against mines and mills across Colorado. In the end, the corporations won out, severely curtailing the union's strength. The union was left largely underfunded and disorganized, never again reaching the same power it had maintained during the 1890s. Although the Western Federation of Miners would not hold on to its influence across the West for very long, miners and workers throughout the area continued to be represented by unions such as the United Mine Workers and the Congress of Industrial Organizations. One of the first instances of Waite's contributions to government labor relations emerged just 7 years after the Cripple Creek strike. In 1902, during the anthracite coal miners' strike, which jeopardized national energy, President Theodore Roosevelt sided with striking miners, threatening the use of federal troops if the miners did not receive less hours for more pay, an early milestone in the process of union relations with the U.S. government. In the 1930s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal promoted reforms that greatly benefited unions. FDR passed the Wagner Act in 1935, which kept employers from interfering in the affairs of labor unions, and founded the National Labor Relations Board, which assisted in union organization. Later, in 1962, President John F. Kennedy recognized the rights of federal workers to collectively bargain and unionize. This fostered the growth of public unions in the U.S. that continue to remain influential to this day, in the form of unions such as the American Federation of Teachers and the American Postal Workers Union. Presidential support of the labor movement on a federal level strongly mirrors the frontier of government labor relations set by Governor Davis Waite in the Cripple Creek strike. As historian John R. Morris says, Waite was a social pioneer of his time, a courageous fighter for the rights of the people against private interests, one of the greatest friends labor has ever had. The Cripple Creek strike of 1894 was one of the most provocative and transformative frontiers in America's labor history. Governor Davis Waite's initiative of supporting the miners was groundbreaking during a time in which Western miners and workers lacked almost any political representation and were subjected to the whims of powerful corporations, which in many cases were in league with local government. The strike's success shattered established traditions of government-corporate alliances and laid the groundwork for federal cooperation with labor through the works of the Roosevelt presidents and JFK. To this day, public unions remain powerful and beneficial thanks to collaboration with the federal government, while the influence of private sector unions has been severely impaired over the past century, as large corporations continue to exercise mostly unchecked control over their workers. We will do well to remember the critical frontiers set by Governor Waite and the Western Federation of Miners to this day.